Chad Dales from TDR, the Dales Report, where we profile companies that are making waves in their ever-growing industries, including the world of esports and sports betting, where we saw a major wave to begin to develop in Canada a few weeks ago with the passing of Bill C-218 legalizing single event sports event wagering. To discuss this major change and what it may mean from a capital market standpoint, we welcome you to this portion of our event called Place Your Bets, and happy to be joined with three industry-leading executives. First, let's welcome David Vinokurov, CEO of Fandom Sports Media Corp. David is an accomplished executive with more than 12 years of extensive business and corporate development experience from a variety of industries. Most recently, Mr. Vinokurov served in a management consulting role to publicly traded social commerce company, plus several fintech and blockchain-enabled payment companies. Mr. Vinokurov has directly contributed to the raising of tens of millions of dollars for startup and small cap companies. David, great to have you here today.
Pleasure to be here, Shad.
Great to have you. Our next guest is Jordan Gnat, founder and CEO of Playmaker Capital. Playmaker is a game-changing platform that sits at the nexus of sports, media, gambling, and technology that is marrying an ecosystem of sports fans across multiple channels. Prior to founding Playmaker, Mr. Gnat was Group Senior Vice President of the Stars Group, which is the parent company of PokerStars, and Chief Commercial Officer of Fox Bet from 2018 to 2020. Mr. Gnat was also Senior VP of Strategic Business Development at Scientific Games from 2011 to 2018. Jordan was also previously named of Canada's top 40 under 40 honorees. Jordan, welcome to the panel.
Thanks, Chad. Look forward to it.
Our last guest is Scott Burton, CEO from FansUnite. Scott is a chartered professional accountant with over 20 years of operational experience, is considered a pioneer in the esports betting industry. He co-founded tedbets.com, an award-winning peer-to-peer wagering platform, which was awarded the 2014 Game to Watch Award at ICE Totally Gaming, the leading casino and sports betting industry exposition. Scott was the chief executive officer at Ascot Entertainment prior to its merger with FansUnite, which trades at the CSE under the ticker symbol FANS, and has experience securing and overseeing multiple gaming licenses in several licensed jurisdictions. Scott, welcome to the panel.
Thanks for having us, Chad.
Yeah, so let's begin with this panel. What I mentioned earlier, where we saw a major wave to begin and to develop in Canada a few weeks ago with the passing of Bill C-218, which is legalizing single event wagering. Let's start with you, Scott, with a look at the new law itself. How does it change the current sports wagering landscape in Canada?
Yeah, so I guess for people who don't know, historically, with the federal laws here in Canada, you weren't able to bet on a single sporting event. So you couldn't bet for the Leafs to win. Everything had to be what's either called a parlay or a multiple,
right?
Which, is a disadvantage for the bettor. And really, I think forced most serious Canadian bettors to look for alternatives that were offshore operators that did allow for the single event betting. So it's kind of a handicap to the government run sites here in Canada by not being able to offer that. So that's the big change now is, all the operators here in Canada that are the provincial lottery corporations are going to be able to put out I would say a more competitive product to the offshore operators and try and recapture a lot of that business that's gone away. So it's a huge shift for Canadian betting, and it's really the first step, I think, for creating a really competitive sports betting market here in Canada.
It's a big game changer for sure. So how much change can we see and how much excitement will this generate for the overall industry?
We're seeing a lot. I mean, you saw it I think the reaction to the markets as it was coming with, companies like the Score, companies like ourselves, and all the provinces gearing up. So Ontario is making big moves to open up to outside operators prior to the end of this year. They're already talking about having single event betting in place for the NFL, which is, the biggest betting season in North America. So huge excitement and overall size. I mean, I think it was the CGA's estimate that there's, 14 billion plus being wagers offshore right now. So a big chance to capture that betting revenue and the tax revenue and create more industry here in Canada. So, we've always been a Canadian-based company, but never thought we could participate in the Canadian market. And this is really the first time I think there's going to be opportunities for people like us here at home.
It's great. Times are changing. David, you're CEO of Fandom, which trades of the CSC under the ticker symbol FDM. Are you already eyeing the Canadian market now that the change has occurred? And if so, what kind of growth can we anticipate here in Canada over the next 2 years?
Oh, well, we're definitely eyeing the market. Obviously, being a Canadian company, as Scots, with our technology developed here in Canada, I think it's very important that domestic companies are able to be at the forefront in supporting the industry and nurturing jobs in the industry and creating opportunities within Canada, expanding the tax base. So we are a part of the Canadian Gaming Association. We are closely monitoring the events. As Scott said, Ontario is moving quickly to be live by the end of the year. Now, the definition of being live, that isn't completely transparent yet.
Yep.
In terms of the policies, the procedures, there's always a lag between it being legalized and then regulated and, having the whole support bureaucracy set up. So, we're closely monitoring the situation. We're building out the teams and the processes, under existing regimes that exist and following the best practices because, ultimately it's a global industry. We're waiting to see what the Canadian regulators, the provincial regulators, namely, are going to do in terms of setting up the nuance within each market and, try to stay nimble and be a part of the conversation as it unfolds.
Well, you mentioned taxation. It's a question for all of you, and David, we'll stick with you. Throughout deliberations, legislators continue to reference that legalized sports betting would eliminate black market offshore betting and keep the money in country and taxable. So what are the expectations in reference to that? And what does that, I guess, where does it sit today and what can we expect moving forward across the country?
I have to be honest, I haven't seen any numbers that I want to rely upon yet.
Still early, obviously.
It's still early in that regard. And then, my experience, unless it's passed and it's written down and it's codified in paper, it's just speculation. Whatever it is, obviously, we're happy to pay it. Like I said, to support industry and to support the other ancillary benefits to the local economy. At the end of the day, it's the politicians writing the laws. And then, as industry participants, we want to have our voice heard and make sure they're as fair as possible, equitable as possible. And ultimately, I just want to make sure from perspective of the CEO of Fandom, that Canadian companies have an equal, if not better, opportunity to have a real presence in the market as opposed to having foreign operators just swoop in and, start buying up market share.
Right. Jordan, you care to comment on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting position, right? The reason why the governments in particular focus on Ontario, because they'll be the first one, March 2020, when they put a law in place to open up the market to international operators. The reason they did that is to channel as much of the unregulated market into the regulated market,
right?
Recognizing that the OLG on its own, with all of the foreign competition, wasn't going to be able to capture. And when you take a look at how to set taxation rates, the good news is that we don't have to invent anything. There's a lot of data out there from a lot of markets, in particular in Europe, in particular in Scandinavian markets, that can give some direction and some visibility into what could potentially be an Ontario market with international operators competing with government-run entities. So in Denmark, Danske Spil, who actually runs is the government-run Danish lottery, the government said, Danske Spil, you're going to be able to operate here, but we're also going to allow international operators. And they set a tax rate between 15 and 20%, which seemed to be a reasonable tax rate. And they were able to channel over 90% of the unregulated market into the tax-paying regulated market.
Wow.
It does two things. One of the key things is the regulated market, of course, as we say, it's going to benefit Canadians because taxes are being repatriated. But what it also does is it protects consumers. And ultimately, you regulate for two reasons. The first reason is the economic. The second, and not necessarily the less or more important, but the second is to make sure that you have a healthy environment. A healthy environment means you have rules and regulations in place to protect consumers. And I think that when we, as this market begins to evolve and the AGCO begins to put out its regulations, it's going to focus on looking at those examples and to put in place things that don't set tax rates too high, then you make it uncompetitive and you have to remain competitive. And don't make them too low where potentially they aren't maximizing the benefit that could be available to Ontarians and ultimately to all Canadians.
Scott, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I think one of the key things that we'd like to see with, when this comes into place is probably some good education around it as well, coming out of the provincial governments. I think what we've seen in some other places is that, consumers hear that it's legalized now and they don't distinguish between regulated and unregulated sites. They just think gambling's legal. Or the sports betting sites are now properly run, and that's not always the case. So unless the government, I think, does some additional education around it for the consumers, but also some enforcement. I think Canada's got a history of zero enforcement when it comes to offshore operators, and I think there's going to need to be a combination of things to protect consumers, which is ultimately, one of the best benefits out of regulation. But then to make sure that, people who do come in, follow the rules, go through the regulatory process, can be competitive. So that's our thing. I think there's definitely going to be a tax benefit. We know that. There's definitely going to be a bunch of revenue coming back to the provinces. But unless they also work on the other side, which is the education and enforcement, there'll be some challenges.
Yeah, makes sense. Jordan, the province of Ontario is expected to be a first mover when it comes to offering competitive marketplace for single sports wagering. Do you agree with that? And if so, does it in any way suggest that U.S. operators will find it easy to obtain a license here?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, March 20th budget, or the March 20 budget, put in place the framework for Ontario to open up the marketplace to third-party operators. They have now given the AGCO the authority to go ahead and be the body that is going to go to an issue. We'll call them licenses. They actually aren't even sure what they're going to call them when it gets there. This past week, the AGCO set up their iGaming subsidiary. So we can see that there is actually movement. And as David said earlier, the timeline seems to be end of the year to be in a position to have international operators available in the marketplace to deliver their product to consumers. I think that you're going to find anybody and everybody who wants to come to Canada, look at Ontario as a great opportunity. The Ontario market, 14 million people, we punch way above our weight in online gaming in general. Going all the way back to, you can trace Ontario's growth in online gaming to the hockey strike in 2004 and Chris Moneymaker winning the World Series of Poker. You just saw this crazy spike where there's nothing else on TV except this thing called the World Series of Poker, and all of a sudden poker takes off and online gaming takes off. We have a lot of roots in the history of online gaming, actually out of Toronto in particular, out of the province of Ontario. So I do think that there's going to be a really big market here. And I think that you're going to find anybody who wants to come to this market. The regime seems to be an open marketplace, so no unlimited licenses available. I think that's the healthiest market. Doesn't create what you see in the US and some markets where they limit licenses. It creates artificial value creation for some and devaluing for others. And it creates just an unhealthy market where the operators can't be competitive. And one of the things that I would certainly stress when government, as government sort of sits down and looks at what are the final regs, competition is going to come from all angles. The internet is by its nature open competition. Yeah. And there are going to be a lot of operators who just don't want to get licensed. And the only way that you can continue to channel as much as possible through the regulated markets is going to be by making sure the product that's out there is competitive. Things like poker need to have liquidity. You need to have lots and lots of liquidity. If you regulate poker just to the province of Ontario, you're going to have a less competitive product than if they have it available to all Canadians and potentially out to the world. It also talks about the type of products. What type of betting are you going to make available? In-play betting. What type of advertising are you going to allow? All of those things are critical to make sure that the ecosystem of online gaming works.
Off there. Like what's give me an example of an operator that doesn't obtain a license. He doesn't have a lot of the stuff that you outlined. So what are the advantages in addition to what you've already said, opposed to, say, an operator that would not have a license?
Yeah, so an operator who does, let's say if you have an operator who does not have a license, they don't have to pay the taxes that a operator that would have a license would pay. They're not subject to the same sort of rules and jurisdiction in terms of player protections. They can also offer things like credit. where a licensed operator tends not to be able to offer credit to their teams. Why? So then the big question is, why would somebody like, you have an operator like Bet365 currently operating in the Ontario marketplace, why would they go and willingly say, hey, I'm about to pay 15 to 20% tax and I'm good with that? And that's a question a lot of people ask. And the real answer is because it's good business.
Yeah, of course.
At the end of the day, it's stable. You much rather, and coming from my years at Stars Group, we were very focused. And part of what I did was open up these markets. We were incredibly focused on our desire to pay tax. It creates a stable market. It creates rules and regulations that ensure that you as a business, an operator, in particular publicly traded company, that you can go to your shareholders and say, that's a good market that I'm operating in, as opposed to if you're operating in an unregulated market like Russia. Those markets can change on a dime and your revenue can be impacted significantly.
Interesting.
You'd much rather have the stability of a regulated market.
David, what would you say are the expectations when it comes to homegrown competition?
My expectation is that it's going to be a very competitive market. You have, as Jordan was saying, Bet365, one of the largest operators in the world, with significant human and capital resources, that's already here. It's going to cause, the domestic players to up their game very quick, to deliver a compelling product and service to the consumers. It'll cause the cream to rise.
Right.
As Jordan was saying, with Bet365 being in Canada already in advance of it actually, being regulated, let's say, everybody wants to operate in the light. You have a global business that has certain standards around the world. I think they're all going to revert to the mean, and it's about global best practices. At the end of the day, the internet is a global platform. So everyone's got to keep their pencil sharp and make sure they're delivering the best product, most compelling service. And that's in full compliance with the laws. Back to what Scott was saying with the enforcement and the education, I think that's a huge part of what's necessary to help the market mature as quickly as possible. If we take a couple steps back and look at what happened with legalization of marijuana in Canada, there was a lag between legalization and the displacement, or even starting to see displacement of the black market with what you see today. Obviously, there's still room for growth. I think, my hope is that the government was taking notes on that process to eliminate that lag time. My hope is that, the regulations are established, they're clear, concise, they're competitive, and, let us as, entrepreneurs and business owners get at it as quick as possible.
100%. Let's go. Right. And it's like, I'm looking at this industry, and unlike cannabis, paint the picture, and a question for all of you, and Scott, will begin with you, but what does the marketing branding opportunities present from this industry? You look south of the border right now, and a lot of the Fox Sports regional markets have now changed to Bally Sports. Could we see a lot of naming rights to arenas? Paint the picture as to what we can look like from a pure branding opportunity that this market will present itself.
Yeah, I think the branding opportunities will almost get to be the size of the betting market. You see the numbers going around in customer acquisition costs in the US and the marketing spends that FanDuels and DraftKings are doing. It's kind of insane, and we'll see that here. We're already starting to see it with certain groups that are doing .net sponsorships of teams and organizations and hockey rinks. So it will be a tidal wave of, a land grab. I think we saw that in the US. We'll see it here. Naming rights, the jersey rights, everything will be done. We'll see, sports books in arena, all the things you've seen in the US, I expect to see here. The CFLs, they were talking about it helping to save the CFL.
Right.
The leagues are going to benefit from this. So we saw a major.
Think about that. A brand new industry that's old, but looking at already saving a league, and it's just getting started, right? That's the kind of pull and leverage it has, right?
Yeah, I was just going to just touch on what Scott said. If you sort of think about the amount of money that gets spent to acquire customers, and you think about what feeds this ecosystem, and David mentioned earlier about the job creation here. Sports betting, we tend to focus on a lot as the operator, because that's the brand, that's the retail front door that you see. It says FanDuel, but at the end of the day, what you really end up seeing is that the ecosystem is populated by a whole bunch of service providers, whether they are content providers, whether they are fans providers, like my company, Playmaker. We're in the business of delivering fans into the ecosystem. All of those things are critically important for the success. So when we think about this industry, it isn't just what those retailers spend and where they spend it. It's also all of the other elements of it that are delivering economic benefit to it. So the naming rights are one thing, but the ability to get commercial advertising is another thing. But it's just also the ancillary product and the ancillary purchases that get done in order to really drive a very healthy ecosystem. Truthfully, I love the amount of advertising they're spending because that's the business that I'm in. So I absolutely love it.
Well, when we look at this industry, like I look at the state of New Jersey, there's 9 million people. They did $5 billion in revenue last year in sports betting. You look at Canada right now, as you said before, Jordan, 14 million people that live in this province, 30 million across the country, 35 million, I should say. We look at a lot of, like, obviously the user that are betting on games, but I'm always trying to educate people, even at our platform, to look at the bigger picture. And that's the stock market within these industries. So based off of that, what kind of opportunities does this present, knowing that this industry will mature and the opportunities that it'll present for investors in this space?
Listen, I think that if you take a look at the companies, the score we talked about earlier, DraftKings, FanDuel is looking at whether they do an IPO, all of the SPAC market opportunities that have come out. The capital markets are looking for places to place a bet. And sports betting is as good of an industry as any. It's the same as, we've mentioned marijuana industry. It's something that it's been around forever, but all of a sudden it's come out of the shadows. And that allows for commercial and institutional investors to get into businesses that are mature by virtue of the fact that there is a built-in economy around them. The question is, how fast do we bring it from the shadows into the light? And sports betting is going to be the exact same thing. But there are going to be winners and losers. There's no question there are going to be winners and losers. Nobody's making money right now as retailers. There are definitely profitable parts of the ecosystem. People selling content into it, that do geolocation services, payment processing, the advertising deliverers. They're all making money today in that part of the ecosystem. And if you're betting on the sports betting world, if you will, I would encourage investors to look up and down that value chain to take a pick of where it is that you want to be. There are free to play games providers. It's a fee for service provider. There are B2B providers who are providing the technology and operational expertise for the front end retailers. So the big brands are out there. They're the ones spending money on advertising. There are going to be winners and losers in that, because not everybody can continue to burn, 10, 50, $100 million a month in advertising. And we've got giants. And those giants can spend a lot.
David, winners and losers, like you're building obviously a platform. Canada is an important market for you, but let's face it, you guys are international as well and in China. So winners and losers, how do you compete with some of the bigger brands from the early days, and what's your long-term, sustainability for the drive of the company?
So again, just to echo what Jordan was saying, it's to use the mining analogy, there's picks and shovels, right? There's a lag time between the starting of development, feeding the entire ecosystem, right? There's lots of offshoots of that. And then ultimately we have the consumer facing, operating brands. Fandom's trying to differentiate itself by developing technologies that increase the user experience across, the consumer facing ecosystem. So whether it's business to business, business to consumer, so, following behind what Scott's been able to do with FansUnite, right? So, there's different parts of the ecosystem. When it comes to, customer acquisition costs, the amount of money, 50 million, 100 million a month for customer acquisition, there's very few people that can compete with that. Very, very few, less than a handful. And there'll be even winners and losers, even at that scale. So, what's the differentiating factor? What's the uniqueness? What's the value add to various parts of the ecosystem? If you remove gambling, it's the same economic question that you have to ask yourself in every single sector that you would consider investing in. And I think if companies remain focused on what they're good at, it's small steps lead to big breakthroughs is a mantra of mine, and you just got to keep executing on what your core mission is, and the race is on. That's what makes all of this fun, right?
You guys made big news obviously earlier this year with the merger of Ascot Entertainment and FansUnite. So is this a trend that we'll see, and what should investors take out of this as far as getting to know the industry more?
Yeah, I mean, consolidation, I think, will be a trend. We're starting to see it, and I think we saw that in more mature markets. So I think Jordan mentioned it, like it's kind of a new market in North America, but it's a very mature market in other areas like Europe. So where we have seen a lot of consolidation, and I think that's going to happen here. You've already seen some big ones with DraftKings and SB Tech. And so I think part of that land grab is to acquire as much assets as you can. And ours was a merge of bringing technology together with some operations, or, the operation or the retail type sites. So I think you'll see a lot of people examining their tech and deciding that maybe they need to own it. Historically, I think a lot of operators were really the marketing, branding side of the business and relied on a few big players for the technology piece. I think at the scale these companies are getting to, they're going to bring that in-house, and that's where we kind of sat. We've been building technology around the betting space for 5 years, multiple licenses. Really with a focus on esports. So the Ascot Entertainment business was shifted in 2014 to be an esports betting group. That served us well, but then we were bringing traditional sports back into the mix as the US opened up and as Canada was approaching. So that's how the merge with FansUnite happened. So yeah, I expect there to be plenty of consolidation, and that's really where the public markets come in, I think. So, as a publicly traded company, we've done 2 financings this year, so 3 within the last 12 months. And 2 acquisitions, one being that merge. So we're preparing for that, and being publicly traded helps. So you want to look at people, I think, who are strong cash positions, a good business model, good teams, and can establish themselves in a regulated market, because there's going to be people out there, either being bought or being the buyers.
When it comes to betting right now, from the feedback that I get, it's almost divided right down the middle. People that are 35 and younger and people that are 35 and older. COVID has changed a lot of things. So question for all of you, and Scott, we'll stick with you. Paint the picture for me. When it comes to the esports side, the virtual side, and the betting side, we see where this is going and the trend that's going to develop. What should people take note that are traditional sports betting people? And how much growth have you seen, obviously, since COVID changed a number of things across our world?
Yeah, I think, the traditional sports betting people, and I think they've all come around, which was different from when we started in 2014 talking about esports, is that you have a massive group of people here who are, 18 to 30-year-olds currently, and a huge tidal wave of them coming behind, who are esports fans. We're approaching 700 million esports fans in the world. A recent survey of them said 52% would bet on esports. And then you see the drop off of traditional sports betting fans. So I think as an operator, you've got to pay attention, or a traditional sports book. You have to look at that and say, there's a future here. I think some UK operators during the pandemic saw esports and probably virtual betting thrown in there of, rising up to 3 to 5% of turnover. We're hearing that people expect esports betting to be 10% of turnover in the next decade, which turns into some really big numbers. But I think it's a different type of product. So just tacking esports or sliding it into an existing sports book, that's kind of our argument, is that that's a challenge. So we've kind of come at it from a different angle, and that's what we provide to people. So a pretty quick solution to esports betting, which we think is highly engaging, tailored to the esports fans, and it just can't be ignored at the size of this market and how it's growing.
Jordan, you're CEO, you're well entrenched, speaking to people every day. What are some of the trends and feedback that you receive?
Yeah, so I think the most compelling trends that we see in general is that people are looking for a new way to be engaged with traditional sports and to make sure that that viewing experience and that level of loyalty and experience that they have just in the true social environment around everything else they do in the social world is brought into sports.
Right.
Now, sports, we view sports as it's the great equalizer. You walk into Scotiabank Arena, the person you're sitting next to, you could be in the Platinums. These tickets are $400 a ticket. The person sitting next to you could have bought the ticket or could have won it at a raffle, could have been given to them because their employer gave it to them.
Right.
But for the next 3 hours, you're all a Raptors fan.
Right.
And when the Raptors score, you're high-fiving. And that's the great equalizer of sports. And what I think we're going to see is we're going to see a continued trend in how we continue to build that community around it and that community of inclusion. I think esports has done a fantastic job in doing that with the advent of platforms like Twitch. Twitch brought a community together. It took people who were sitting in discrete places in your home or in an esports club and said, I can talk to somebody else. I can watch somebody else. I can create chats with other people. And that is how a younger demographic communicate. I used to call my friends. My children text their friends. It's not, and they say, I spoke to so-and-so. Well, they didn't actually use words out of their mouth, but that is the way that they communicate. My parents wrote letters. They didn't talk on the phone. So we just have an evolution of communication. And I think that's really the trend, is how do we continue to create communication and content that keeps people compelled? Sports betting is one way to do that. Esports is growing like crazy. Who would have ever thought 5-10 years ago that you'd be building esports purpose-built arenas?
Right.
I mean, that's beyond sort of the average, I'm just going to put up a website. That's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of commitment to infrastructure. That's when something, I believe, has really sort of hit the mainstream, is when people who are in traditional businesses like real estate come back and say, there's an opportunity here to put a venue in place that I think I can fill. That's a really, really compelling argument to say the trend of esports is a real trend. This is not a fad.
So does it make sense from a business strategy for all of you to focus on, try not to flip, let's say, a traditional sports bettor to an esports betting platform and just focus on what they know? Or does it make sense to obviously get them to flip? And David, we'll begin with you.
Just again, to echo what Jordan's saying, it's not a question of flipping from one to the other.
Right.
I think, the trend that we're seeing ultimately is a convergence of user experience, of fan engagement, of community building. So whether you just want to, challenge someone to a prediction, challenge them to a wager, go to a full-fledged, sophisticated parlay bet with statistics. I think the ultimate winners in the industry from an investment perspective, from a business perspective, are going to be, the companies and the firms that create that, environment for people to interact with each other in a compelling way that allows them to do these different things in a centralized platform, in a stadium, or maybe even, as I'm watching it at home, I'm challenging my friend that's in a stadium. Second period, I get a notification. Shad's just challenged me to a bet that, someone's going to score a goal this period, right? We're only limited by our.
I won that bet, right? Did I win that bet?
I think, I just sent you $20. There you go. But all joking aside, it's creating that experience. Building out the technological capabilities to speak to a global community, whether it's an esports fan, a sports fan. What's the difference? I have nephews that are AAA hockey players. They don't watch hockey on TV. They watch, EA Sports, esports hockey. So where do you draw the line? My prediction is in 5 to 10 years, it's all esports. As Jordan was saying, it's content, it's engagement. And, whether you want to take a bet or, shoot a tweet or a message or a text or an emoji, as long as you're facilitating those interactions and touch points, I think that's where the real value will come in.
Makes sense. Well said. And times are changing for sure. I want to wrap up, obviously, this conversation, this panel, with some of the stuff that we talked about earlier with regards to Canada. It's across Canada. Provinces will be left to decide exactly what single game betting will look like within their respective borders. The rumors are that in Toronto, for example, for instance, is eyeing internet gaming market that could allow private sector firms to compete against one another for business and bets, while others may opt for something more restrictive. So saying this, what is the preference of the industry, and does a patchwork set of regulations across the country present a new set of challenges? If so, what do you anticipate? And David, we'll begin with you.
Listen, I don't think anybody wants a patchwork of rules and regulations. It complicates business and increases costs to business. Ideally, you'd want a level playing field with everybody. I think some of the advantages that some of the operators that are in the country have now is that there are no regulations, so they do what they want. And going back to Scott's point with the education and the enforcement, that ultimately filters down to the user, to the player experience. So, dealing with one regulator is tough enough. Having to deal with 10 or 11, it doesn't help. But again, it's a high risk industry in terms of its history. But the faster that they can put the best practices into place, I don't think anybody on this panel would hesitate to follow the letter and the spirit of those practices.
Yeah, Scott, you care to comment?
I would just say, what would the industry want? We would definitely want to see an open market. So I think the way Ontario is heading is probably the best approach. Same as David, patchwork is bad for us, but it's what I expect we're going to get, at least initially. So we're optimistic in terms of the opportunities that are opening up for companies like ourselves in Canada. Wait and see on how that rolls out.
How do you see this all unfolding, Jordan?
Yeah, so I agree with Scott and David. This is going to, in an ideal world, you would have one set of rules, but we don't live in this ideal world, and we haven't seen that happen yet. There is hope, and there is hope that there will be some commonality. Tax rates will be different in each province, because each province has a different need and want, or has a different bent towards, is it about money or is it about consumer protection? And so tax rates aren't very difficult for operators to manage between. The good news is that Ontario is going first, and the AGCO is a global leading regulator. This is not a small town backwards company. The AGCO is globally recognized as one of the top regulating bodies, and so the fact that they're the ones who are setting the initial framework, a standards-based approach to this, is very, very encouraging. And so it is possible that we'll see the other provinces adopt, if not all, but most of what the AGCO has put in place. Save and except, I think tax rates will be different in each province. Some provinces, as you have in the US, some states won't allow college sports. Some provinces may have particular products or offerings or markets that they aren't going to make available. But ultimately, if we can end up with a really, really close set of rules around this, I think we're going to be in a really, really good spot. The provinces have a strong experience of working together. The Interprovincial Lottery Corporation was set up, decades ago to do games like 649 and Lotto Max and national scratch tickets. So there are products that are already interprovincial, shared amongst the same set of rules across the whole country. However, the proceeds all go to different places. So they do figure out a way to find what is good for me as the province of Alberta versus the province of Saskatchewan, yet we as the province of Ontario may have a different view. So I'm hoping that the provinces look to the current structure, the Interprovincial Lottery Corp, as a model for how they can work together, and use the AGCO as, who I would view the top tiered regulator in the country, as the one who's going to create a framework that they all live within. I'm hopeful. I would say I'm hopeful. I'm not entirely optimistic that it'll be as simple as I've described it. But as I said, we couldn't be in a better place knowing that Ontario is really the one going first.
Well, the bill has passed. That's the first step, right? We're still early stages. I want to wrap things up. This panel has been presented by the Dales Report, Amuka Esports, and most importantly, the Canadian Securities Exchange. So let's wrap things up here in Canada. Number of estimates on the true value of this market. DraftKings recently said Canada is a $5 to $8 billion market. BetMGM sees it at $7 billion. So when you look at this industry over the next 10 years, what kind of potential exists? And how could this space actually get as far as overall growth? It's a question for all of you, and we'll wrap it up here. But Jordan, we'll begin with you, and then after with Scott and David.
Sure. There's often a bunch of metrics that are put out there. One of them is revenue, and the other one is handle. And so, if we're talking about actual revenue, not the amount of money that's wagered, my view is if you add together sports betting and iGaming, this is easy in my mind, and easily a $10 billion revenue market, not handle, but actual revenue generated.
It's great, Scott.
Yeah, I can't disagree. That's kind of the numbers we've been thinking, maybe slightly higher, but in that 8 to 12 billion is what we've been doing. And again, looking at revenue and not, the actual, the size of the bet volume.
And David?
Strike three, those numbers are pretty accurate. It's not going to be $100 billion market, unfortunately, but it's large enough market that, you have three firms such as ourselves on this panel going after the same piece of pie. And I'm sure everyone's going to have a nice piece on their plate as we all continue to execute on our plans.
David Vinokurov, CEO of Fandom Media Sports Group, trades of the CSC under the ticker symbol FDM. Scott Burton, FansUnite, CEO, trades of the CSC under the ticker symbol FANS. And Jordan Gnat, the founder and CEO of Playmaker Capital. Thank you for taking part and place your bets. We appreciate your time, gentlemen.